Chapter 1. The Roots of the American Far Right. From the KKK to McCarthyism. Origins of White Supremacy and the KKK post-Civil War. The origins of the American far right are deeply intertwined with the turbulent aftermath of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era that followed. It was a time when the United States, bruised and battered from a bloody conflict, grappled with profound questions about freedom, racial equality, and national identity. It was in this cauldron of societal upheaval and tension that white supremacy found its footing, leading to the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, and setting a course for future extremist movements in the country. At the close of the Civil War in 1865, the United States embarked on the challenging task of reintegrating the Confederate States and addressing the status of over 3.5 million emancipated African Americans. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to all born in the United States, and protected the right to vote regardless of race, respectively. But while these legal changes signaled progress, they also ignited a fierce backlash from many white Southerners who viewed them as a direct threat to their societal status and way of life. It was against this backdrop that the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865. Initially conceived as a social club in Pulaski, Tennessee, by 6 former Confederate officers, the KKK rapidly evolved into a secretive vigilante group. Donning robes and masks to conceal their identities, Klan members sought to restore white supremacy by terrorizing Black Americans and their white allies. Their tactics were ruthless, employing intimidation, physical assault, and even murder to achieve their ends. Lynchings, a barbaric form of public murder often carried out with the pretext of avenging some perceived crime, became a hallmark of Klan violence, instilling fear and cementing racial hierarchies. The Klan's ideology was rooted in a perverse interpretation of American values. They co-opted symbols of patriotism, portrayed themselves as protectors of white womanhood, and argued that their vision was essential to preserving the true spirit of the South. This narrative was, sadly, appealing to many white Southerners who felt disoriented by the rapid societal changes unfolding around them. The Klan, in their eyes, wasn't an extremist group, but the vanguard of a cultural renaissance, fighting to restore a lost golden era. The federal government, realizing the growing threat posed by the Klan, took actions to suppress its activities. The Enforcement Acts, passed between 1870 and 1871, criminalized the use of intimidation or violence to prevent citizens from voting. Using these acts, President Ulysses S. Grant launched a crackdown on the Klan, leading to numerous arrests and a temporary decline in their activities. However, by the late 1870s, with the end of Reconstruction and the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, the conditions were ripe for the resurgence of white supremacist ideologies. While the Klan of the late 19th century would decline in influence, the ideologies it championed persisted and found expression in other forms. Jim Crow laws, enacted from the late 19th century through the early 20th century, institutionalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement. These laws, buttressed by pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy and eugenics, ensured that Black Americans were relegated to second-class status. The early 20th century witnessed a revival of the Klan, bolstered in part by D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK as saviors of the post-Civil War South. This reborn Klan expanded its reach, targeting not just Black Americans but also Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and other perceived outsiders. It claimed millions of members in the 1920s, holding significant political influence in many states. As we transition from the early 20th century, the narrative progresses to the era of World War II and the Cold War. It was during this time that the American far right began to meld its long-standing white supremacist ideologies with anti-communist sentiments. The figure of Senator Joseph McCarthy emerges as emblematic of this shift. While McCarthy's primary focus was on rooting out perceived communist sympathizers, the tactics he employed drew from the same playbook of intimidation and character assassination that white supremacist groups had used for decades. In conclusion, the roots of the American far right are both deep and tangled, stretching back to the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and its subsequent evolutions offer a window into the broader societal struggles of the time. White supremacy, while manifesting in different forms, remained a constant thread, influencing American politics and society in ways that would set the stage for future extremist movements and ideologies. This chapter serves as a foundation, providing context for understanding the complex tapestry of the American far right in the subsequent periods covered in this work. The Red Scare and Anti-Communism fervor. The early 20th century, punctuated by 2 world wars and the rise of various political ideologies, was a period of significant upheaval on the global stage. As nations grappled with the aftermath of these cataclysmic events, ideological battles began to take center stage. In the United States, as in many parts of the world, the specter of communism began to loom large, leading to what is now often referred to as the Red Scare. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which saw the establishment of the first communist state in Russia, sent shockwaves around the world. Many Americans viewed the rise of communism with deep suspicion, associating it with anarchy, radicalism, and a direct challenge to the American way of life. This fear was not unfounded. Communists, by their very ideology, sought a global proletarian revolution that would upend existing social, political, and economic hierarchies. As the 1920s dawned, these fears began to manifest more tangibly. A series of events, including labor strikes, bombings, and the rise of radical leftist movements, exacerbated the perceived threat of communism. The press, politicians, and public figures began sounding the alarm bells, warning of a communist plot to infiltrate and overthrow the American government. It was in this climate that the first Red Scare truly took hold. In 1919 and 1920, the U.S. government, under the leadership of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, embarked on a series of raids, often referred to as the Palmer Raids, targeting suspected communists and radicals. Thousands were arrested, often without just cause, and many, particularly immigrants, were deported. Due process was frequently overlooked, as the overriding sentiment was one of quelling the Red Menace at any cost. The media played a crucial role in stoking these fears. Newspapers, both local and national, ran sensational stories highlighting the communist threat. Political cartoons depicted the Bolshevik menace as a monstrous figure, creeping into American homes and institutions. The narrative was clear. Communism was not just a foreign political ideology, but a direct and imminent threat to American values and the nation's very existence. While the intensity of the first Red Scare waned by the mid-1920s, the underlying anxieties remained. The Great Depression of the 1930s, with its economic hardships, further complicated the landscape. As Americans grappled with unemployment, poverty, and a general sense of disillusionment, leftist ideologies, including communism, began to gain traction among certain sections of the population. The American Communist Party, though never a significant force in mainstream politics, found new members among those disenchanted with capitalism's perceived failures. However, the real crescendo of anti-communist fervor came in the aftermath of World War II. With the war's end, old alliances crumbled, giving way to new geopolitical realities. The world found itself divided between the democratic, capitalist West led by the United States and the communist East led by the Soviet Union. This division set the stage for the Cold War, a period of intense political and military rivalry between the two superpowers. It was during this time that the Second Red Scare, often associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy, reached its peak. McCarthy, a relatively unknown senator from Wisconsin, burst onto the national scene in the early 1950s with sensational claims of widespread communist infiltration within the U.S. government. Armed with lists of supposed communist sympathizers and employing theatrical, often bullying tactics, McCarthy spearheaded a campaign that left a trail of ruined careers and tarnished reputations in its wake. McCarthyism, as the phenomenon came to be known, was not just about rooting out actual communists. It became a broader tool to suppress dissent, target political rivals, and enforce a narrow vision of Americanism. Accusations of being soft on communism were weaponized, leading to a climate of fear and self-censorship. Hollywood, academia, and the arts were particularly hard hit, with blacklists preventing many from working due to real or perceived communist affiliations. The anti-communist fervor of the time also had profound implications for American foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, were all shaped by the desire to contain the spread of communism. Internally, policies were enacted to monitor and curtail the activities of suspected communists, leading to debates about civil liberties and the power of the state. By the late 1950s, the intensity of McCarthyism began to wane. McCarthy himself was censured by the Senate in 1954, and his influence rapidly diminished. However, the legacy of this era lived on. The deep-seated fears and divisions it engendered influenced American politics, society, and culture for decades to come. In closing, the Red Scare and the broader anti-communism fervor of the 20th century offer a window into the anxieties of a nation coming to terms with its role as a global superpower. It's a testament to the power of ideology to shape perceptions, policies, and ultimately the course of history. As we delve deeper into the roots of the American far right, it's essential to recognize these moments as foundational, influencing the trajectories of movements and ideologies in the years that followed. Senator Joseph McCarthy's role in amplifying fears. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, would come to symbolize one of the most divisive periods in American history. His rise to prominence in the early 1950s, a time of great international uncertainty and domestic unease, marked a turning point in how the American public perceived and responded to the perceived threat of communism. While anti-communist sentiments had been simmering for decades, it was McCarthy who brought these fears to a fever pitch, using a mix of audacious claims, theatrical tactics, and sheer force of personality. McCarthy's journey to becoming the face of American anti-communism began rather unremarkably. Elected to the Senate in 1946, he spent his initial years in office without much distinction, often seeking issues that might earn him greater publicity and support. His chance came in February 1950, when during a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he dramatically claimed to have a list of 205 known communists working within the State Department. This explosive allegation, albeit with shifting numbers in subsequent retellings, catapulted him into the national limelight. This audacious claim was the spark that ignited what would become known as the Second Red Scare. The American public, already on edge due to the Cold War's geopolitical tensions, Soviet espionage revelations, and the recent fall of China to communism, was primed for McCarthy's brand of aggressive anti-communism. However, what set McCarthy apart from other anti-communist crusaders was not just his claims, but his methodology. McCarthy's tactics were marked by a brazen disregard for evidence and due process. Those accused by him were often presumed guilty until proven innocent, reversing the foundational principle of the American justice system. His Senate hearings, rather than being impartial inquiries, often resembled inquisitions. With a keen sense for drama, McCarthy played to the galleries, using innuendo, guilt by association, and character assassination to tarnish reputations. The atmosphere in these hearings was so intimidating that few dared challenge McCarthy directly, fearing personal and professional ruin. The media played an unwitting accomplice in McCarthy's rise. His flair for drama, combined with the gravity of his claims, made for compelling headlines. Even as some journalists and editors expressed skepticism about McCarthy's methods and the veracity of his claims, the sheer spectacle of his campaign ensured that he remained a constant presence in newspapers, radios, and the burgeoning medium of television. Yet, it would be a mistake to view McCarthy as merely a product of his time or an opportunistic politician. At his core, McCarthy tapped into a deeper vein of American anxiety. His portrayal of a nation under siege, its very institutions infiltrated by agents of a malevolent foreign power, resonated with many. His narrative was simple. America was in danger, and he was its protector. This binary worldview, where the lines between good and evil were clearly drawn, found eager takers. For many, McCarthy wasn't just a senator, he was a sentinel guarding America's sacred values. But this narrative had profound implications. As McCarthyism, the term that came to define this era, took hold, the fabric of American society began to strain. Friendships, family ties, and professional relationships were tested as suspicions ran rampant. Hollywood, a significant cultural institution, faced McCarthy's scrutiny, leading to blacklists that barred many talented individuals from working due to real or perceived communist affiliations. Universities, publishing houses, and other cultural institutions also felt the chilling effects of McCarthy's campaign, as self-censorship became the norm, and any deviation from the prescribed narrative was viewed with suspicion. However, McCarthy's meteoric rise was matched by a rapid fall from grace. By 1954, even as the Cold War raged on, many Americans began to grow weary of his tactics. His credibility suffered a significant blow when he targeted the U.S. Army, leading to a series of televised hearings. It was during these hearings that the famous retort from the Army's counsel, Joseph Welch, came, rebuking McCarthy with the words, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" This moment, broadcast to millions, marked the beginning of the end for McCarthy. His decline was swift. Later that year, the Senate censured McCarthy, a formal condemnation that, while not removing him from office, significantly diminished his influence. By the time of his death in 1957, McCarthy had become a largely marginalized figure, his brand of politics discredited. Yet, the legacy of McCarthyism lived on. The fears he stoked, the divisions he sowed, and the challenges he posed to American democracy's foundational principles left an indelible mark. For many, McCarthyism came to symbolize the dangers of unchecked power, the perils of mass hysteria, and the fragility of civil liberties in times of crisis. In reflecting on this era, it's essential to recognize the complex interplay of factors that enabled McCarthy's rise. While he was undoubtedly a product of his time, his impact on American politics and society went beyond mere historical circumstance. McCarthy, with his audacity and conviction, amplified existing fears, pushing the nation to confront its deepest anxieties and insecurities. As we delve deeper into the roots of the American far right, understanding the role of figures like McCarthy becomes crucial, for they provide insights into the broader currents that have shaped and continue to shape the nation's political landscape. Anti-establishment sentiment in American society. At the heart of many populist movements, including the far right, is a deep-seated anti-establishment sentiment. This sentiment, which spans across different eras and political movements, can be described as a profound distrust and disdain for the perceived elites or ruling class, viewed as out of touch, corrupt, or even traitorous. While the likes of the KKK and figures like McCarthy capitalized on specific fears related to race and ideology, their narratives also tapped into broader frustrations with the establishment. In examining the roots of the American far right, understanding this anti-establishment sentiment is crucial, as it forms a thread that connects disparate movements and ideologies. To contextualize anti-establishment sentiment, one must first recognize the foundational ethos of the United States. Born out of a revolution against a distant monarch, the very DNA of America is rooted in a suspicion of centralized authority and an emphasis on individual rights. The framers of the Constitution, wary of unchecked power, enshrined principles that emphasize checks and balances. This inherent skepticism towards authority is reflected in popular sayings, cultural artifacts, and even policy debates that have persisted over the centuries. Over the years, this foundational skepticism has been catalyzed by specific events and circumstances. The late 19th and early 20th centuries, characterized by rapid industrialization and urbanization, saw profound economic and social shifts. As industries grew, so did the influence of business magnates, often referred to derogatorily as robber barons. Many Americans began to feel that these elites, with their immense wealth and influence, were dictating policies and shaping the nation's direction to serve their interests. Populist movements of the time, like the progressive movement, arose in response to these anxieties, advocating for reforms that would curtail the power of these elites and give voice to the common man. The financial crashes and economic downturns that periodically jolted the American economy further exacerbated these sentiments. The Great Depression, in particular, led to a widespread belief that financial elites and policymakers in Washington had failed the American people. New political voices, both on the left and the right, emerged, critiquing the establishment and offering alternative visions for the nation's future. World events, too, played their role. The world wars, while unifying the nation in many ways, also sowed seeds of distrust. The complex geopolitics of these wars, with secretive treaties and backroom deals, gave many Americans the impression that the nation's foreign policy was being dictated by a cabal of elites with their agendas, often distinct from the interests of the average citizen. The entry of the United States into World War I, in particular, was viewed by many as the result of the machinations of industrialists and financiers, rather than a principled stand for democracy. This sentiment was further inflamed during the Cold War. As previously discussed, the Red Scare, characterized by its hunt for communist sympathizers, was not just about ideology, but also a critique of the establishment. McCarthy and his ilk often painted the elites in Washington as either complicit with the communists or woefully naive, thereby endangering the nation. This narrative, that the establishment was either traitorous or incompetent, resonated with many, further deepening the chasm between the public and their perceived leaders. Yet it's essential to understand that anti-establishment sentiment was not the sole preserve of the far right. Throughout American history, voices from across the political spectrum, from the left-leaning populists of the early 20th century to the anti-war activists of the 1960s, have articulated their versions of this sentiment. What sets the far right apart is the manner in which they've melded this sentiment with other ideologies, be it white supremacy, nativism, or extreme nationalism. The rise of media, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, played a significant role in amplifying and shaping anti-establishment narratives. Talk radio, cable news, and later the internet provided platforms for voices that positioned themselves in opposition to the mainstream. These voices, often operating outside traditional journalistic norms, presented alternative narratives that further eroded trust in traditional institutions. In sum, the anti-establishment sentiment that has periodically surged in American society is a complex phenomenon, shaped by historical, economic, social, and cultural forces. While it manifests differently across eras and movements, its essence remains consistent: a profound sense of disillusionment with the ruling class, a belief that the system is rigged against the ordinary citizen, and a yearning for a return to a perceived golden age. As we navigate the intricacies of the American far right, recognizing the power and allure of this sentiment is crucial. It provides the emotional and ideological fuel that propels movements, galvanizes followers, and challenges the very foundations of the American democratic experiment. The push against progressive movements of the 1960s. The 1960s in the United States was a decade marked by turbulence, change, and profound social upheaval. From the civil rights movement to anti-war protests, from feminist rallies to the birth of counterculture, the nation was undergoing a seismic transformation. The progressivism of the 60s, with its call for greater inclusivity, justice, and equality, was not merely a political stance, but a profound cultural shift. Yet, as with all movements of change, it was met with resistance, a pushback that would come to define the roots of the American far right and shape the nation's political discourse for decades to come. The civil rights movement, with its clarion call for racial justice and equality, was one of the most prominent progressive movements of the decade. Led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., it sought to dismantle the entrenched system of segregation and discrimination that had persisted in the American South. As African Americans organized marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, their struggle received national and international attention. The images of peaceful protesters being met with police brutality, the resonating speeches advocating for nonviolence and justice, and landmark events like the March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, galvanized support for the movement. However, the push for civil rights was not universally embraced. In the South, white segregationists, backed by local politicians and law enforcement, fiercely resisted desegregation efforts. The Ku Klux Klan, which we've traced in its early origins, experienced a resurgence, committing acts of terror against African Americans and their white allies. But the resistance was not merely in the form of overt violence. Across the nation, especially in suburban and conservative areas, there was a deep-seated discomfort with the rapid pace of change. Many white Americans felt disoriented by the transformation, perceiving it as a direct challenge to their way of life and societal status. Parallel to the civil rights movement was the rise of the anti-war movement, spurred by American involvement in Vietnam. Young Americans, many of whom were at risk of being drafted, took to the streets to protest what they saw as an unjust and unwinnable war. Campuses became hotbeds of activism, with students organizing rallies, teach-ins, and even occupying university buildings. The anti-war movement, with its challenge to governmental authority and its questioning of American foreign policy, further amplified the sense of a nation in flux. The feminist movement, too, gained traction during this period. Building on the momentum of the civil rights and anti-war movements, women across the country began to challenge societal norms and expectations. They demanded equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to systemic discrimination. The 1963 publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is often cited as a catalyst for this renewed wave of feminism. Women began organizing, forming groups like the National Organization for Women, NOW, and challenging the patriarchal status quo. Yet, much like the other progressive movements of the time, feminism was met with resistance. Many, both men and women, viewed it as a threat to traditional family values and roles. They feared that the push for equality would upend societal structures, leading to the disintegration of the family unit and the broader moral decay of the nation. The confluence of these movements created a cultural milieu that was both vibrant and volatile. The counterculture, with its rejection of mainstream norms and its embrace of alternative lifestyles, music, and art, further added to the sense of a nation undergoing profound change. However, the progressivism of the 1960s did not exist in a vacuum. It was met with a robust conservative counter-movement. This pushback, which would lay the foundation for the rise of the American far right, was rooted in a deep-seated desire to preserve the status quo. For many conservatives, the 60s was a decade of chaos, moral decay, and societal disintegration. They yearned for a return to an idealized past, a time they perceived as more stable, orderly, and in line with traditional American values. Leaders like Barry Goldwater, though unsuccessful in his 1964 presidential bid, articulated this conservative vision, emphasizing limited government, states' rights, and individual freedoms. Richard Nixon, recognizing the nation's mood, successfully employed a law and order platform in his 1968 presidential campaign, tapping into the anxieties many felt about the decade's upheavals. In essence, the push against the progressive movements of the 1960s was not just a political stance, but a profound cultural and societal reaction. The decade, with its highs and lows, its triumphs and tragedies, set the stage for the polarized political landscape we recognize today. The roots of the American far right, as we've traced through the lens of the KKK, McCarthyism, and now the conservative response to the 60s, are deeply intertwined with the nation's broader struggles around identity, values, and the meaning of progress. As this chapter concludes, it serves as a reminder of the cyclical nature of history, where moments of profound change invariably lead to reactions, counter-movements, and the constant negotiation of the American identity.